It was a bright, tense morning at the International Defense Forum in Berlin. Flags fluttered in the breeze outside the sleek glass walls of the venue, while inside, world leaders, generals, and media crews gathered for what was billed as the most important security summit of the year. The United States delegation arrived with swagger. Pete Hegseth, former Army officer and now a vocal political figure, took the stage early in the day. His voice rang with pride. "Let's not pretend, we have the best military in the world, period. No one else comes close." The audience, packed with defense analysts and politicians from across the globe, murmured in polite acknowledgement. But in the back row, Ibrahim Traoré sat quietly, arms folded. Burkina Faso's president wasn't there to clap for colonial arrogance. Later that afternoon, it was Traoré's turn. As he walked to the podium, the room shifted, cameras clicked. Everyone knew he wouldn't play by the rules. He paused, scanned the crowd, and then spoke. "I heard someone say they have the world's greatest army. I won't name names, but I assume they're talking about those well-fed generals with 3 chins and 0 victories." Laughter erupted, then silence. Then applause, from unexpected corners. Traoré didn't smile. "If your strength is measured by how many bombs you can drop on the poor, then perhaps. But strength without principle is just brute force. And brute force crumbles." Pete Hegseth, seated 2 rows from the stage, clenched his jaw. Traoré continued, "We don't parade missiles. We build unity. We don't worship weapons. We teach our children to defend their land, not to conquer others." Outside the venue, clips of Traoré's speech were already trending. Some called it disrespect. Others called it truth. Either way, the world was now watching. And Hegseth? He was just getting started. Backstage, Pete Hegseth was pacing. The hum of political chatter around him faded beneath the thunder in his ears. Traoré's jab wasn't just a personal insult, it was a direct shot at the image of American military dominance. He wasn't used to being laughed at, especially not by a West African leader who, in his eyes, had no business challenging the global order. An aide leaned in. "Sir, it's all over social media. Hashtags trending in Europe, Africa, even the US." "What hashtags?" Pete snapped. The aide hesitated. "Hashtag fat generals, hashtag Traoré, hashtag Africa claps back." Pete's face flushed. Across the city, in a more modest hotel room, Traoré reviewed footage of his speech with his small team. He wasn't celebrating. He was calculating. He knew the storm he'd stirred. Burkina Faso didn't have the luxury of careless words, but sometimes, truth required fire. "They'll say I mocked them," he said calmly. "Let them. Sometimes, the empire needs to be shaken to hear the cry of the people." His advisor, Aminata, nodded. "They're rattled, sir. But now they'll push back. I'm counting on it." That night, Pete Hegseth appeared on an American news network. With fire in his voice, he declared, "This so-called leader mocks our military? Let me remind the world, we've built peace through strength. We've toppled tyrants." Traoré's response came swiftly. At a live panel the next morning, when asked to comment, he simply said, "Tyrants? You created most of them." Gasps. One sentence. That was all. The forum was no longer about defense. It had become a stage for an ideological war. On one side, imperial pride wrapped in medals. On the other, a quiet insurgency led by a man in plain fatigues with nothing to lose and everything to fight for. And still, Traoré hadn't raised his voice once. In that calm, the world heard thunder. The forum's third day began under a different tone. Military panels were replaced by emergency roundtables. The U.S. delegation demanded a private meeting with NATO allies. Traoré's name, once a footnote in the schedule, now echoed in every corridor of the venue. American media doubled down. Disrespectful, radical, anti-American, words flashed across the screen like bullets. But while networks in the West fumed, African platforms celebrated. In Mali, students gathered around a single radio, replaying Traoré's words. In Nigeria, street artists painted murals of him facing down armored tanks. In Senegal, elderly men at tea stalls whispered, "Did you hear what he told them?" he said what we couldn't say for 50 years. Meanwhile, Pete Hegseth wasn't finished. At a press briefing, he stood flanked by generals, all adorned with medals like badges of past glory. He leaned into the podium, voice heavy with controlled rage. Let's be clear. The United States does not take lectures from leaders of tiny, aid-dependent nations. The silence that followed wasn't submission, it was tension. Because somewhere in the room, everyone felt it, something had shifted. And hours later, Traoré responded, not with another speech, but with an announcement. Standing in front of a modest map of the Sahel, he declared, "As of today, Burkina Faso has officially ended all remaining military cooperation agreements with nations that station troops on our soil without equal partnership. We will train our people, defend our land, and we will no longer play house in someone else's empire." Cameras clicked. No theatrics. Just a firm voice and a line drawn in red sand. Back in Washington, a Pentagon official grumbled, "He's dangerous." But others disagreed. "He's different," one retired general whispered on a panel show. "He's not anti-American. He's just pro-African. And we're not used to that." Behind the scenes, the State Department scrambled to control the narrative. But it was too late. On TikTok, young creators were remixing Traoré's quotes with beats. On Twitter, he trended above presidents. And in the halls of Berlin, Pete Hegseth sat in a private lounge, watching the world cheer a man he tried to humiliate. The empire had spoken, but so had the continent. As the diplomatic storm raged globally, Traoré returned to where his revolution had always drawn its strength, not from podiums or panels, but from the soil. In rural Burkina Faso, the president stood ankle-deep in the muddy fields of a cooperative rice farm. The cameras captured it all, no presidential convoy, no security phalanx, just Traoré rolling up his sleeves, laughing with farmers, speaking in Diola and Mossi dialects, hands in the earth. "Power," he told a young boy planting saplings, "doesn't live in palaces. It grows here." Meanwhile, in Washington, Pete Hegseth was preparing for a televised segment on national security. But his team was uneasy. Polling numbers had shown an unexpected dip in support among younger veterans. Many admired Traoré's bluntness, his discipline, even his contempt for bureaucracy. "He talks like the soldiers wish we talked," one aide admitted. Pete brushed it off. "He's a populist, a glorified farmer in fatigues." But in Africa, that was the point. On Al Jazeera, an exiled Cameroonian journalist said, "Traoré is building something rare, a military man who doesn't dream of thrones, but of dignity. His weapons are words. His army is the people." And that army was growing. Kenya invited Traoré to speak at a Pan-African summit. Ghana sent an official delegation to Ouagadougou. Even leaders who once kept him at arm's length were beginning to lean in. The idea was spreading, Africa wasn't poor, it was plundered. And now it was remembering. Back in Berlin, Pete Hegseth tried to pivot. He scheduled a high-profile interview to reframe the narrative, to portray Traoré as a destabilizer threatening Western alliances. But during the broadcast, something unexpected happened. The host, a seasoned German journalist, cut in, "Mr. Hegseth, you say Traoré undermines Western stability. But isn't it also true that for decades, Africa's stability meant silence, poverty, and compliance?" Pete's smile tightened. "We've brought development." The host replied, "And yet, they cheer for him." "Not you." The screen went dark. In that pause, between image and silence, something had broken, not a nation.an illusion. Traoré's rise wasn't just a story anymore, it was a movement, and movements ripple. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, murals began to appear, not just of his face, but of symbols, a shovel, a seed, a broken chain. The old narrative, of helplessness, debt, and dependence, was cracking. In South Africa, students organized a forum titled "Reclaiming the Narrative, From Aid to Autonomy." The keynote? A live stream of Traoré's address, not from a state palace, but from a village school in Bobo Dioulasso. "There are two maps," he said to the students watching across the continent. "One that shows borders. And one that shows who owns the minerals, the ports, the farms. The second map is the truth. And we are rewriting it. That phrase, "we are rewriting it," trended across social media platforms. But not everyone was clapping. In Washington, Pete Hegseth huddled with defense analysts. He was no longer speaking like a TV host, he was strategizing like a general, a real one. "We're losing ground in the only war that matters now, influence," he muttered. "If Traoré gets another 6 months, he won't just inspire rebels, he'll build alliances." He wasn't wrong. Behind closed doors, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Guinea announced a joint economic corridor, mineral trade, military training, agriculture. But even more dangerously, they pledged media cooperation. No more filtered press from Paris or DC. They would tell their own stories, in their own voices. Pete knew the battlefield had shifted. So he reached for an old tool, fear. On live television, he warned, Traoré's ideology is spreading. It's anti-West, anti-democracy. If we don't act, we'll have African leaders building Chinese bases and Russian alliances before the decade ends. But even as he spoke, satellite footage showed something unexpected, not Chinese ports, nor Russian mercenaries, but African engineers, laying tracks across the Sahel. Trains, built with local labor. Broadcast towers, built with student cooperatives. It wasn't foreign influence Traoré was inviting, it was foreign exit. Pete saw it and grew still, because somewhere deep down, he understood the truth that no general, no matter how decorated, wanted to admit. The war was already lost, and it hadn't been fought with bullets. It had been lost with a seed, a map, and a microphone. Pete Hegseth's silence didn't last long. Within hours of the satellite images going viral, he appeared again, this time not in a suit behind a news desk, but in uniform, standing before a crowd at West Point. He spoke of order, legacy, strength. But the cadets weren't cheering. They were watching Traoré's speech clips on their phones. Something was shifting in the very bones of power. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Traoré convened a rare closed-door summit. The room was filled not with diplomats, but with engineers, farmers, tech students, and young military officers from across the Sahel. On the table was a blueprint, not for a weapon, not for a wall, but for a school. Before, he told them, they said we needed their money, their machines, their mercy. But what we really needed was belief. In ourselves. In each other. One delegate, a young woman from Niger, raised her hand. "Mr. President, they call you dangerous. A destabilizer." Traoré smiled. "Then let them call us all dangerous. Because stability without justice is just another cage." That quote made headlines around the world. And this time, it wasn't confined to African media. Even The Guardian, Der Spiegel, and the New York Times ran editorials asking, "Is Africa finally breaking the cycle?" Pete Hegseth watched it unfold like a slow avalanche. One he couldn't stop, only brace for. So he made a move. Behind the scenes, Pete met with NATO advisors. The conversation was hushed, but not harmless. Economic sanctions were floated. Intelligence briefings were requested. The goal? Pressure. Isolation. Containment. But it was too late. In Senegal, a major port signed a deal with Traoré's new alliance to prioritize West African goods over European imports. In Chad, student protests erupted demanding curriculum reforms inspired by Burkina Faso's education model. Pete's playbook, control the money, control the message, was falling apart. At the next NATO press conference, a journalist asked Pete directly, "You say Traoré is a threat. But isn't he just doing what Western nations always preach? Independence, innovation, sovereignty?" Pete's eyes narrowed. "He's not playing by the rules." The journalist replied, "Maybe that's the point." And in Ouagadougou, as a group of children painted a mural of Traoré lifting a broken chain into the sky, the president looked out over the crowd and said quietly, "We didn't break the rules. We just stopped obeying theirs." By now, the story had shifted. Traoré was no longer just a president. He had become a mirror, and the West hated what it saw in him. While Pete Hegseth scrambled to regain narrative control, cracks in the Western image deepened. At a DC think tank roundtable, one analyst whispered what no one dared say aloud: what if we've lost moral ground? Meanwhile, Traoré was in Ethiopia, standing in the heart of the African Union. Not as a guest, but as a fire starter. The age of aid is over, he declared. Not because we hate help, but because we reject dependency. Dignity cannot be outsourced. Some applauded. Others, especially Western diplomats in the room, shifted uncomfortably. One even stormed out. The speech was broadcast in full on African state TV, but cut down by major American networks. Pete Hegseth, furious at the editing criticism, claimed in a Fox News segment that Traoré was a glorified populist hiding behind tribal pride. But the insult fell flat. A clip of Pete calling Traoré tribal went viral, this time, not because it was shocking, but because it was tired. In South Africa, a cartoonist published an image, Pete as a crumbling Roman statue, Traoré walking past him planting seeds. Even within the U.S., black leaders began to speak up. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett posted, "You can't preach freedom abroad and panic when others define it for themselves. Africa isn't rejecting the West, it's reclaiming itself." Her post got over 1 million likes in 48 hours. Pete's team tried to spin the narrative: organized chaos, anti-Western aggression, ideological extremism. But every attempt only further exposed the frailty of the empire's voice. In a closed military briefing, a general said, "This isn't about guns or gold anymore. It's about gravity. And right now, Traoré's pulling the world towards something we don't control." Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré returned from the AU summit to a crowd that had waited 8 hours in the sun just to see him. But he didn't address them from a balcony. He walked into the street, stood shoulder to shoulder with them, and said, "I don't want to be a symbol. I want to be a servant. If history writes my name, let it also write yours." The chant began again, louder than ever. "Not your colonies. Not your colonies." Pete Hegseth watched the footage with his jaw clenched. The empire was tired. And Africa was wide awake. Pete Hegseth was running out of moves, but he wasn't out of fight. Backed by a powerful media apparatus, he launched a full-blown campaign to reframe the global conversation. Headlines appeared like synchronized drumbeats. Traoré's dangerous vision for Africa. Can Burkina Faso handle its own revolution? African pride or political delusion? The message was clear: Traoré's movement wasn't mature, it was risky. Dangerous. Childish, even. But in Ouagadougou, Traoré met these accusations with calm precision. In a live panel streamed across African platforms, he leaned into the microphone and said, "They fear what they cannot control. And what they cannot control, they label a threat." The camera didn't cut away. His words echoed across time zones. Meanwhile, Pete appeared on a Sunday morning political show. His tone was harsher now, more desperate. "You don't get to rewrite the rules of global power just because you're loud," he barked. Traoré is a charismatic disruptor, sure. But so was Gaddafi, so was Chavez. We know how those stories end. But that comparison backfired. Online, young Africans replied with memes, Traoré photoshopped as a lion facing a crumbling empire. Quotes from his speeches turned into street graffiti in Lagos, Dakar, Nairobi. Even in Harlem, a mural went up, Traoré, eyes forward, a quote beside him. Not a threat. A reflection. Pete's frustration boiled over. He demanded a classified security review of Burkina Faso's alliances. Rumors of foreign influence were floated: China, Russia, Iran. Anything to suggest Traoré wasn't acting alone. But even internal memos revealed an inconvenient truth: there was no puppet master. This was homegrown. Indigenous. Pure. A top analyst wrote in his report. What scares us is not his strength, it's his clarity. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré visited a girls' school that had been built entirely with local materials and labor. Standing in front of a chalkboard, he looked at the students and asked, "Who owns your future?" A dozen hands shot up, their voices united. "We do." That clip alone garnered 50 million views in a week. And Pete Hegseth, watching from a DC office full of silent screens, realized something terrifying. The war wasn't for land. It was for the story. And he was losing it. It was no longer just a clash between two men. It had become a collision between two eras, one fading under the weight of its own arrogance, the other rising with a voice that refused to echo old empires. Pete Hegseth convened a special strategy session at the Pentagon. Around the table sat generals, intelligence officers, and media liaisons. Maps glowed under fluorescent lights, Burkina Faso circled in red, with arrows pointing in from all sides. Traoré's message is viral, one advisor said. He's weaponizing hope. Pete slammed his fist. You don't fight hope with hashtags. You fight it with strength. But the room was silent. In contrast, Traoré had just returned from a visit to a tech incubator in Accra, Ghana. The crowd wasn't full of politicians, it was filled with teenage coders, engineers, and dreamers. He stood beneath a mural of Sankara, smiled, and said, "Empires crumble. But ideas endure. Build with your minds, because they can't bomb that." The moment went live on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube, crossing borders before any government could spin it. Meanwhile, Pete made one last play. He pushed for sanctions. Claimed Burkina Faso was undermining regional stability. The White House remained cautious, but under pressure, they released a vague statement. "We are concerned about the trajectory of leadership in Burkina Faso." But that statement had a reverse effect. African leaders, even those skeptical of Traoré, rallied around him. In a surprise announcement, a coalition of West African nations declared a mutual sovereignty pact. Economic, digital, agricultural cooperation, free from Western aid strings. Pete watched the broadcast, his face frozen. And then it happened. A classified memo from the State Department leaked online. It showed internal discussions admitting that Traoré's programs had reduced migration, boosted local economies, and stabilized regions once dependent on U.S. aid. The truth had slipped out. And people were listening. In the streets of New York, protesters began holding signs that read, "If Traoré were American, he'd be president." Even former U.S. diplomats began writing op-eds titled, "Why Africa's New Voice Matters." The machine Pete had relied on was rusting. Narratives were breaking. Control was crumbling. And in Ouagadougou, Traoré stood before a crowd and said, "They wanted to silence us with threats. But we answered with unity." The crowd roared. And this time, the world didn't look away. The sun rose over Ouagadougou, but the streets were already alive. Flags waved from balconies, not of foreign nations, but of a new identity, Pan-African, self-made, unapologetic. On this day, Traoré was set to speak, not at a summit, not at the UN, but in the heart of a local village where his policies had first taken root. The same soil that once struggled to yield rice now blossomed with golden stalks, planted by hands that once begged for aid. He stood on a wooden platform, wearing no suit, no medal, just a simple shirt stained with dust and pride. Behind him, a mural, Pete Hegseth pointing sternly, and Traoré laughing defiantly beneath the words. "Your fear doesn't make us small." Traoré raised a hand, and silence fell. "We were never poor," he began. "We were never broken. We were simply interrupted." The crowd held their breath. For too long, they defined us by what they gave, grains, weapons, loans. But now we are defined by what we build. Cheers erupted, but he held up a finger. And to those like Pete Hegseth, who ask what right we have to lead ourselves, I say this: the right was never yours to give. The message spread across the globe like wildfire. African diasporas in Paris, London, Chicago gathered in squares to watch his address streamed on massive screens. A new kind of nationalism had emerged, not bound by flags, but by dignity. Pete Hegseth, watching from a DC newsroom, felt something foreign creep in: respect. Not agreement. Not surrender. But respect for a man who didn't blink in the face of the old world. He sat for an interview that evening, his tone softer than ever. They called him radical, Pete admitted. But sometimes, radicals are just men who speak truths before we're ready to hear them. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré sat with children under a tree, teaching them how to read maps, not of old borders, but of new futures. A little girl asked, "Will they come back to take our land?" Traoré smiled gently. "No. Because now, we know it's ours." And that was the real victory. Not just sovereignty. Not just narrative. But the quiet, unstoppable realization that Africa was no longer waiting for permission. It was writing its own history.